Next, from Springfield, we talked to Dr. Brent Clark, the Executive Director of the Illinois Association of School Administrators, about the process so far of implementing the state's new school funding formula and whether Illinois school districts are reaching their so-called adequacy targets. This runs about 20 minutes.
Dr. Brent Clark, thanks for joining us again on the Illinois Channel. And last time we spoke, it was in the midst of trying to get the school funding formula passed, and we didn't know if the schools were going to be funded or not. Here we are in the end part of October. Fortunately, we do have a funding formula, and we wanted to follow up with you and see, now that we have that and we have the funding reforms, what is happening relative to the application and carrying out those reforms in school districts across the state? So can you just, first of all, let's start with that update.
Sure. So we've come a long way since mid-August when we last visited out in the lobby here at the ISA headquarters. As you know, the last few days of August, the House and the Senate both passed what's now known as Senate Bill 1947. The governor signed that on the 31st of August, and it's become the law of Illinois since then. The work now has started pretty strongly. You've got a couple tracks going. You have the State Board of Education who's going through the bill. They're verifying data, if you will, with districts because it's a completely different new formula, and they're looking at verifying enrollment data so that when they start funding schools with the new money. Now, schools are getting old money now, but when the new money starts to go out to schools, they're starting from what they believe will be a threshold of accurate data. So they're taking time this fall to do that. They've more or less told us or indicated to us that school districts would likely start to see a portion of their new money starting in January or sometime in early 2018. So then they would be getting all their new money between whatever that initial point is. Let's say it's January of 18, then by June 30th of 2018, their 17-18 money would come in that bucket. School districts today are receiving what we call old money, which is the base funding minimum. That's comprised of the state aid total that they received last fiscal year, plus their special education reimbursements, plus their bilingual reimbursements, all packaged together in what's called base funding minimums. They started receiving those in September. They caught them up from the month of August. They missed 2 payments in August. Those were caught up. Now we're on schedule getting 2 payments a month of base funding minimum. So as we roll into the next calendar year, which was halfway through the fiscal year for schools, you're going to see the base funding minimum continue, plus the new tier distribution, we call it, new money, start to hit school districts.
So one of the net effects of the funding formulation, as I understand it, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, first of all, that there's going to be more money available for some of the what were the poorer schools, or some of the places where ag communities, as we say, where they didn't have a dense population and properties to tax, as well as some of those areas like, again, I always use East St. Louis as one famous example where the property values are low, and you know, so those schools were underfunded typically. So am I right about that? And as you say, are they going to start receiving their monies? Would they start receiving more money under the new formula as early as January, or might that have to wait until the next fiscal year?
No, it would start in January. You have this broad spread between school districts functioning well beyond adequacy and those well below adequacy. So the school districts that function below adequacy, somewhere in the 40 to 90% range of adequacy, those are what we call Tier 1 and Tier 2 districts. They'll receive the lion's share of the new tier distribution money. That starts to flow, we believe, in January. So clearly the kinds of schools you described there, largely rural or high urban with low EAV, high population, those schools will most likely all be in Tier 1 and Tier 2, and they'll start to receive that new tier distribution money, should be in January, and they would receive the bulk of that between January and June. That would be their 17-18 new money. So That is expected to go, and then the Tier 3 and Tier 4 districts would also be receiving some new money. It would also come in the same time frame.
How would you describe as administrators across the state are implementing these changes? It's probably always daunting when you have a new formula and you have the learning curve, right? But if you can, I'm asking you perhaps an unfair question. I'm asking you to speak for people at large.
Yeah.
Is the education community in Illinois, largely speaking, welcoming these changes, would you say, or what is the attitude now that we have this new funding?
There's an old saying here in Springfield, and I know this saying, and I've said it myself. You always bet on the nothing horse, and in this town, and 9 out of 10 times, you're going to be right with your bet on the nothing horse. And I think a lot of people, as they looked at the school funding battle that we went through in the spring and the summer, were thinking about that old advice and said, well, it's a valiant effort, but we're going to bet on the nothing horse, and 9 out of 10 times we're going to be right. Well, this is the one time that the nothing horse got beat, finally. And it got beat with a brand new funding formula and new money to go into it. So I would say a majority of our members were probably not spending too much time worried about the logistics and the mechanics of a brand new funding formula, because history would tell you for the last 47 years, nothing had changed. It had been pretty much stagnant, and there had been a lot of efforts only to fall short on the last pitch. I say that as a baseball analogy. It's a World Series time, but they'd swing and miss on the last pitch. The nothing horse would come running through and win the day. This time, we hit the last pitch, and we have a new funding formula, new money, and it's going to come to schools. So to get to your point, we've spent time just this past week or two. We've conducted what's called super region meetings, so roughly dividing our population into about thirds of the state, third in the south, third in the middle, and third in the north. We had super region meetings with superintendents and school business officials, and we went through about a 2-hour presentation on, I'd call it like a medium level of the evidence-based model, not a really high level, not a really low level, but just a medium level of what the evidence-based model is, how it works, what they can expect to be thinking about and learning about. And then we're going to come back in January, and we're going to hold a more intimate workshop in 11 different locations across the state where superintendents and school business officials can come to those smaller work groups and learn more about the evidence-based model and almost get to a district focus about what it means for their district. Then we're coming back in February, going to the same 11 locations, and coming back in with the Every Student Succeeds Act, which is the federal law as it relates to accountability. Of course, Illinois has a role in that. We're coming back in February with a workshop on that. So attend the evidence-based model workshop in January, attend the accountability workshop in February, and then we're following that with March, doing 11 workshops in the same locations again for their third sequential workshop, so that they can start to tie together the funding, the spending plan, if you will, the new money, the accountability plan that's required by the federal government, and then how they put together their own plan, spending and accountability-wise, on a district-level basis. So they'll get a start at writing their district's plan. So we're kind of laying out, if you will, kind of the regimen of learning that we think will be helpful to superintendents and school administrators across the state. We also had some videos done by Mike Jacoby with the school business officials and Gary Tipsword, who's a superintendent in Central Illinois. Those two gentlemen did some tutorial videos, about 5 of those. We've put those up on our website for people to watch. They're very good in going into the mechanics of the model, so you can start to learn how the gears kind of work together in driving the model forward. So we're trying to do our business, which is education. We're trying to educate our members, and knowing that this is a dramatic shift from what they're used to, recognizing it takes a while to get your head around these types of mechanics, but we've got some really sharp people too, and we think they're picking up on it pretty quick.
I think what does moms and dads and everyone need to know, and I think you laid out some of it. One thing that strikes me is in this next year, just how much learning the school administrators and superintendents, as you just laid out, have to adjust to.
Correct.
You have not only this new funding formula, we have what used to be the federal mandate on No Child Left Behind, which is now Every Student Succeeds Act, which is known as ESSA.
Right.
And we have the evidence-based model, which I always try to put it just in layman's terms. Simply put, I think we looked around the country at best practices, and we are trying to implement what seemed to work in districts around the country in the most successful schools. Is that a shorthand way?
Actually, there was a lot of research that went into the development of the 26 elements that comprise the adequacy target. Everything's built around the adequacy target for a district. In other words, what does it cost to deliver a high-quality education to every child in every district? And you look at those districts and you say, hey, your demographics are different than mine. Our enrollment's the same, but our demographics are different. So those districts that have a higher population of EL children, higher poverty counts, more special education children, even though they may have the same enrollment as a peer district, their adequacy target's going to be higher because it takes more investment, more dollars to reach those particular children than it would children that are not in those categories of demographics. So I think that you're going to see a lot of learning this year by superintendents, but you're also going to see them start to really make detailed plans about how they're going to apply those new dollars that are coming out of core research, how they're going to apply those dollars and to make it academic gains for kids. If you look at the original researchers on this, Alan Odden and Larry Pikus from the University of Wisconsin and the University of Southern California, they really worked hard around the adequacy target. In Illinois, we added to that in developing the local capacity target, the base funding minimum, and then that tier distribution that really ensures that the new investment by the state is going to those schools that actually needed it the most, instead of just kind of throwing it out there and whoever gets it gets it. This distribution is a really unique, robust part of the model.
Let me ask a couple of quick questions, because we could obviously talk for hours. There's so many different aspects, and we won't do that. But isn't there something in that legislation where there's a review process at some point where you say, okay, now that we've done it for, I don't know when, that's another question. When is that review triggered? Is it at the end of 1 year, at 2 years, 3 years? Where do you say, okay, now that we've implemented this, here's what's working, here's what needs to change?
Right. There's a 5-year mark in the legislation. It's called a professional judgment panel. It's comprised of a broad group of people, not only in the education sector or sphere, but also in the legislature, combined to come together and make a professional judgment panel. At the 5-year mark, they're going to give a review and a report of, hey, here's what's working well, here's what needs changed. One of my goals is by that point to make sure our districts have implemented the evidence-based model correctly. They've taken those new dollars, they've actually done some of those 26 elements. They've charted student achievement, they've looked at graduation rates, and they can say at that point, hopefully, we're moving student academic achievement, we're moving graduation rates because we're implementing these particular elements of the model. In those elements, they have, based on the research, there's an effect size. There's a return on investment calculation as to what you can kind of expect for a dollar invested. What's your return on that dollar? That's in the research world. That's called effect size. So those charts are available to our members. In fact, they're on our website for some of those elements. And we're hoping that, in fact, we have superintendents call and say, hey, where's that effect size chart? I want to know which elements I get the most bang out of, and they want to start doing those first. So that's encouraging that they're starting to do that. I know superintendents today, even though the new money is not going to start flowing until really January, February, I know they've already shrunk K-3 classes because they know they have an estimate of what they're going to get, have an idea, and they've already started to pare down those K-3 classes to shrink the class size so there's more individual attention between those teachers and those kids at the early grades, which has a tremendous effect size. It's a great return on the investment.
Let me ask this. People are going to say, well, that's all fine. There's a lot of details you're covering. At the end of the day, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years down the road, based upon what we're doing, should we as citizens of Illinois expect to see an improvement in the quality of learning that's our students? And I guess that's going to be measured by what, things like ACT scores? Or what?
I would look at college acceptance rates or credentialing for some type of employable skill. I would look at student academic achievement. I don't think student attendance is in there, but I have a feeling that when your kids are engaged and they're enjoying school and there's something there that's attractive to them, I think attendance rates get better. Tardiness goes down, absenteeism goes down. So I think that the types of things that engage children in school, that hold their attention and cause them to want to be there, I think all those markers should be tilting up at that point after we've had a time to invest and implement. And the trick here is in both investing from the state and implementing correctly from the district level. Both of those things have to occur for us to see academic gains. But absolutely, the taxpayers should see some gains.
One of the things last time we talked, and we were, the schools weren't getting funded, then they were getting partial funding. One of the things, that categorical grants weren't getting paid, things like transportation.
Right.
Are the school districts getting caught up on those categorical grants?
They are. So Comptroller Susanna Mendoza just Monday of this week started releasing the fourth quarter MCAT payments, mandated categoricals, things for reimbursement for things like transportation, school busing. She started releasing those payments Monday of this week to schools, so that'll get them caught up for June 30th of 17, and then she's got to start trying to catch them up for the 2017-18 year. But we've worked pretty closely with her office. They've been very transparent in trying to meet the needs of school districts. That we've given them some examples of school districts to talk to that were on the verge of financial insolvency.
So
And,
she's trying to prioritize based upon
no,
what she's hearing?
She really doesn't release one school district over another. She's looking at, does she release MCATs over other state payments based on what's happening in our world of paying bills in the education field. So, but she's been very good to work with, and we appreciate the openness of that office.
And, people, I think, understand, but just to drive it home, schools might be owed tens of millions of dollars, let's say, but they're not going to get that check in one fell swoop. I mean, because, the state is operating on a cash flow basis, and so as the cash comes in, it's prioritized, as you just mentioned, to go out.
Right.
When we spoke lastly, and we didn't yet have a funding bill, some schools had enough money to go the entire year if a bill hadn't been passed. Other schools, you were saying, they weren't sure if they could make it through the end of September.
Right.
Those schools that were hanging on by their fingertips, so to speak, are they now getting the cash flow they needed and expect to, that they're out of the woods financially and know that can continue to operate without interruption, or is there still any kind of a...
I wouldn't characterize them as out of the woods. They're getting two sources of cash flow. They've received 2 MCAT payments in the last 60 days. They received their third quarter and their fourth quarter within the last 60 days from FY17. They're also getting their base funding minimum. So there's enough cash coming in those cash-strapped districts to operate on a minimalist budget. They're not able to implement wide, expansive, far-reaching, student-impacting changes yet because they're truly waiting on the new tier distribution to come. So they're still, it's nip and tuck for them on cash flow. And they'll really start to emerge from the woods once the new tier distribution money starts to roll into their districts. That should come hopefully in January or February. But yeah, they're in a much safer position today than they were back in late August when you and I were talking. Literally September 15th was the close date for some districts in Illinois.
And then lastly, with all these changes, are we done for a while? I mean, you're going to be, as we talked about, you're going to have to be updating people and educating the educators on what all this change means. What didn't you get in the funding formula, or the changes that maybe you had sought? And does the education community still go to the government and say, as an example, maybe mandate relief on certain things, or are we going to kind of hold our position for a while and just let what we have sink in?
I think there's a lot to sink in. A lot has happened. You overlay the federal government's accountability plan. That's more to sink in. The thing that it will be paramount for all of us to be a part of is that annual reappropriation of money to schools and other services that support schools. So we'll always be going back to the legislature on an annual basis saying, hey, we're ready for that next budget, just like the state does every year, and lobbying for that investment into the model. There's not what we would call a continuing appropriation does not exist for the model. So we'll always have to go back and lobby for that going forward, and that's part of being able to go back and show performance, show academic gains, and encouraging them to make further investments into the model. So that would be at the top. The second thing we're looking very closely at will be the teacher shortage issue that we have in Illinois. Just 5 or 6 years ago, you might see 100 applicants for a teaching job. And now we literally have a shortage. We can't find science teachers, special education teachers, specialist teachers, just are virtually non-existent. We have a lot of border counties. I think there's something like 40 border counties, maybe more, border counties in Illinois. And those border counties are losing teachers out because of a range of things. But stability in state government has been one of them over the last 4 or 5 years. Instability in our state government. They're not sure that the pension funds are going to be paid. There's been attempts to wipe out their pensions. And these teachers are just really interested in educating kids and not fighting the bureaucracy in Springfield. So they jump the border and go somewhere else. And so we really need to calm that rhetoric down. We need to find a way to bring stability to our state government and a long-term plan to pay the pension debts that the state has accumulated over time. It's been their management for literally decades upon decades that's created the issue we have, so we need to figure out a way to pay that correctly down so there's some security in the retirement prospects for teachers. We need to attract them back to the profession. That's going to be a pressing issue as we go into the next year.
Dr. Brent Clark, I mean, we have these different organizations, yours, the administrators, the school business officials, the principals, the management side, we might say, of education. At least now I think people can get somewhat of an idea of why these organizations exist and how much work there is to be implemented, as we've discussed.
Absolutely.
Never a shortage of things to talk about. We appreciate your time. We'll follow up again, hopefully in the near future.
Thanks again, Terry. Thanks. Appreciate it.